Okay, there we go. Sorry, everyone. We had a little technical glitch there. YouTube had decided it didn't want to let us go live, but welcome to Ask an Anthropologist About Worldbuilding. I'm here with Sara Temme today to talk about textiles. Before I introduce you, I just wanted to ask one quick question. What is the difference between clothing and textiles?
Oh, great question. Well, clothing is kind of the cut and sewn pieces of textiles, or it could be other things besides textiles that are worn on the body. But textiles in general are, I think the definition is interlaced yarns or threads into a flexible structure. And so that doesn't have to be something that's worn. It can be a blanket, it can be a ceremonial robe, it can be all kinds of other things.
All right. Well, Sara Temme is a textile and apparel designer and an environmental anthropologist who explores the ecology of traditional textile practices. Through teaching, writing, and research, she examines how textiles function as a cultural material and ecological narrative, and social critique, bridging ancestral knowledge with contemporary practice. She's currently pursuing a PhD in applied anthropology with a focus on ethnobiology of textiles. And of course, you can find Sara on her wonderful Substack. Lots of great material on there. And that's over at the Textile Anthropologist on Substack. So thank you so much for coming on today, Sara. And yeah, so that was a really useful kind of distinction because I was wondering like what is that difference? And would you say that textiles is kind of a catch-all for all the things that people make in terms of cloth or garment, or is it, and then clothing is like a subset of textiles? Is that a correct way of thinking about it?
I think so, yeah. So textiles also can encompass things like baskets and even rigid baskets, so or fishing nets. It can be rope and twine. So any sort of, it doesn't have to be fiber necessarily, but it typically is some sort of fiber that's interlaced, interwoven, and made into some sort of a structure.
All right, cool. So tell us, how did you end up focusing on textiles and anthropology? What brought you down that path?
Um, just obsession generally. I would say like my background is in apparel and textiles as my not just my bachelor's degree, but I grew up sewing and doing fiber arts and things like that. I got my bachelor's in apparel design and textiles, and at the same time had a really strong interest in anthropology. Considered double majoring, but didn't really know what to do with anthropology, right? So like um, it ended up when I was doing my undergrad, I noticed that I was focusing a lot on what we might call like ethnic dress or ethnic costume or something like that. I thought it was really interesting, the different methods that people use to make clothing, with the tools that were developed in specific regions and things like that. And it was just kind of like budding into an interest like that. And then at some point, it really just evolved into wanting to focus more on anthropology for intellectual pursuits. And I remember when I started my master's program, I really wanted to do something about the apparel industry or garment workers or, textile recycling or something along those lines. And it there wasn't really a space in the program I was in to like fit in a project that was kind of out of bounds like that. So I focused on environmental anthropology and did like a public education project for my thesis. And but still in the background, I'm sewing, I'm knitting, I'm, like doing all kinds of kind of fiber crafts and things like that. And at a certain point, I just realized like I intellectually can think of textiles as anthropological objects and start researching in that kind of like mindset and going forward from there. And I'm definitely not the only one who had that idea, but it was like a light bulb moment for me, like, oh, I can combine these things and just like do the thing that I love both things equally.
Yeah, and of course, there's a whole subset of archaeology that's, dedicated to textiles and garments and various other things. And because, I mean, there's all kinds of things you can learn from ancient people's textiles for sure. What are you focusing on for your PhD project? Or do you have you're just starting, right? But what are
So
you looking to do?
yeah, so the kind of research project slash program that I proposed when I did my application is ethnobiology of textiles, which really just means the way that different groups of people utilize or interact with plants and animals to make textiles. And there's lots of stuff that go into that. It's a really big topic, and you can kind of narrow down on different things, but I'm looking at a specific, or I at least propose to look at a specific plant that's native to North America that was used for fiber by Native North Americans.
Okay, what plant is that?
It's called dogbane.
Dogbane. Okay. All right.
It's
What
a it's a weed. It's considered a noxious weed now, and a lot of kind of research has gone into what can kill this plant, but it's a
hmm.
really culturally important plant. So yeah, so there's a lot of questions and stuff to look into, at least I think, when it comes to this plant.
Yeah, I can't remember who. Oh, one of my cohort when I was in grad school, he focused on ethnobotany, and he would chastise anyone who used the word weed around him because there are no weeds. That's a cultural norm about what we consider weeds. All these plants are
It's
useful.
true. Yes.
But that was definitely his thing. And if someone said something was a weed, he's like, no. What region of the country is that plant indigenous to?
It's actually native to all of North America, but
Oh,
I'm trying to kind of boundary the project a little bit by looking at the Western United States.
that makes sense. That makes sense. Um, can you define cultural ecology for us?
Oh gosh, a pop quiz.
Well, it's
Cultural
just
ecology.
not everyone who's watching this is going to know the anthropological terminology. So,
Sure. So cultural ecology, I think I would kind of summarize it as the different ways that different groups of people kind of conceptualize the environment around them and the way that those environmental systems work in tandem with one another. So, for example, the way that we name plants, so the taxonomy of plants, right? Like the way that it's viewed and constructed and utilized in Western culture is going to be different than other places. So the way that plants are named, the way that families of plants are grouped together, things like that, those are all cultural constructions. So looking at cultural ecology is really about trying to really deeply understand how different groups of people are defining and interacting with the ecology around them.
that's a great definition. That was a great definition.
Yes.
All right, so now we have our next section, which is your bones to pick about the way that media, and that could be film, that could be books, or could be video games, or shows. How is that problematically, or that rather mistakenly portrayed textiles in those areas?
I have a few bones to pick. I think the one that stands out to me more than anything is about kind of like the impracticality of a lot of textiles and clothing that I see, where you just know that somebody would not be wearing something like that in that climate or
Hmm.
in that condition, or if it got wet, it wouldn't behave like that, right? There's kind of like almost misunderstanding of the technical performance of a lot of textiles that I think gets missed. Which for me is just kind of like an annoyance, right? Like, but I get that people are trying to like build fantastical stories and I can
Yeah,
forgive it.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, no end of, I mean, not exactly textiles, but armor bikinis, for example, are like
Yes,
come on
perfect
now,
example. Perfect
right?
example.
Right. I mean, it's all, of course, performative to our own culture. Like, what is going to make someone look more masculine or feminine based on Western norms, is obviously a problem. Um, do you have any specific examples? Are there any like shows that just really just you're like, oh God, what are they doing?
Not off the top of my head, but I just know that like I don't know why Waterworld is coming to mind in this moment, but I can think about that a lot where when certain fibers get wet, the way they hang on the body suddenly is very different. Or sometimes they even change shape, or sometimes they will change color and things like that. And there's a lot of instances when I've watched movies where I notice things like that, where I'm like, okay, like that would be hanging off of that guy if he was drenched in water.
Yeah, I learned a lot of hard lessons when I was at the end of my teen years in my early 20s, and I was making leather armor for medieval combat, about the various limitations of leather and how much more stiff it is when it's actually useful for armor. It's not very
Hmm.
useful, like if it's just clothing, it's not very useful for armor, but then if it's used for armor, it's extremely restrictive. And then if it gets wet, it warps and moves, and there's all kinds of problems. And that's definitely something for you fantasy world builders out there to know. Um, is that, like look into how leather actually behaves when you're thinking about your characters. Of course, like, sometimes when we're building fictional worlds, we don't consider every little scrap of information, but sometimes there are some really practical things that, like, maybe ask someone who's worked with leather before about how it works. So,
Yeah.
and all the stuff you're seeing in Hollywood isn't really, a lot of it's not really leather. It's mostly plastic and paper mache and various other things.
Yeah.
Um, uh, we have a couple of questions that I have from Facebook here. Um, okay, when you're building a world and you're thinking about textiles, what's the first thing you should think about?
As an environmental anthropologist, I would say the environment. So textiles are going to be constructed usually out of environmental materials. So that could be a
Nope.
seed bowl, things like that. So
Oh,
thinking
we lost you.
about
We lost you there for just a second. Sorry.
uh-oh.
Could you repeat what you said?
Just thinking about the environment and what kind of plants and animals would be living in that environment, because most people, unless they're making industrial textiles out of, chemicals and things like that, they're going to be using plants and animals from the environment in order to make those textiles and in order to make the tools to create the textiles. So it could be, um, a plant like flour or fish skins. I'm sure you know about fish leather, or fur from some sort of mammal. So those are going to be the things that are available in the environment that most people are going to utilize to create these textiles. On the other side of that is in thinking of the environment, just kind of going back to what we were just discussing, you're not going to want like a full leather garment if you're in the tropics, right? So um, maybe that's where
No.
leather bikinis come from. I don't know. but thinking about the way that different fibers and different plants and different, fur and feathers and things like that, not just the availability of them, but like how they would perform in the environmental conditions, and if you would want to wear that on your body, or maybe it's going to be used for more of a ceremonial garment or something along those lines, right? So that's
Yeah.
what I would think about primarily, is where this is taking place and what are the environmental like factors.
Yeah, like people don't realize how devastating climate can be if you're like a military on the march, because not just because it's cold or hot or rainy or whatever, but like the reason that Mongols didn't end up conquering Europe, the thing that delayed them long enough for the Black Death to catch up with them, was that they got to a place where their horses couldn't handle the climate and their bows and their clothing didn't work with the climate. And so they had to stop and really, they took a while to reconsider, how are we going to move forward? Our technologies don't work here. And that bought Europe kind of enough time for the disaster of the Black Death to strike the Mongol Empire and prevented the Mongols from really conquering Europe, because they would have almost certainly otherwise. No one was standing against them. So like environment with clothing, environment with technology, like, you know, in the modern era, we have more things in place to kind of help with that. But if you're building a fantasy world, you're definitely going to have to be thinking about environment with all that stuff for sure. Um, How, this is another Facebook one. How does the practice of making cloth impact the other parts of a person's culture?
Ooh, interesting. So there's lots of great examples about how really entire societies were built around cloth making. So um, you have places like ancient Scandinavia, where, you know, if you have a sailing culture, those sails were made out of cloth, and huge lengths and the labor that goes into making that much cloth was hundreds and hundreds of people's full-time job around the clock, around the
Wow.
year. So thinking about that, where you have entire segments of society who are dedicated to spinning wool, who are dedicated to weaving sailcloth, who are dedicated to preparing it or mounting it on ships or whatever it is. Um, and in addition to that, just thinking about ancient Scandinavia, that cloth was also used as a form of currency as well, or you could pay
Oh,
taxes with it, things like that. So it really is incredible where there's societies all around the world from ancient times to now where cloth really is the center of what that society is built around. And, you know, you can even see now cotton growers in Texas, right? Like there's whole swaths of the state of Texas that are just cotton farmers, and that's everything. That's their entire lifestyle built around it. So yeah, I would say depending on the type of world that you're building, there might be people who are craftsmen who are, you know, actually physically making the textiles. There might be people who are making the tools for the textiles or making the looms or, you know, however the textiles are being created. You're going to have people who are merchants, of course, who are trying to move them through the economy. There's also examples of having like weaving houses where entire kind of segments of society, typically women, are being kind of quarantined into rooms or into like sections of the city where that's all they're doing is weaving full time. And it completely informs their social standing in society. So yeah, I think that it can be as central to the story as you would want it to be, because there's so many examples of textiles being foundational to different civilizations.
yeah. You know, I hadn't really. I mean, when I think of shipbuildings and I think of navies, I think of the massive amount of forest you have to cut down. But it really
Hmm.
had not occurred to me, you have to, if you're having a sailing ship, how much work it would create to build a sail. And that makes sense. So I have a little bit of follow-up question for that. Does that like increase gender stratification in those societies? Because I know now this might be my own stereotype, but like my assumption is that a lot of women, because they can get the stitches smaller, are more likely to be, you know, someone doing these textiles and things, especially on something like that. So in that case, am I correct on that, first of all? And second of all, like, would that increase gender stratification?
So you are correct that in most societies, textile makers are typically female or somehow encoded as being female. But it's not for that reason of being more like gracile, is like what we would call it for a biological anthropologist watching. It's because it was work that could be picked up and put down and could be done at home, could be done. A lot of women will walk and spin wool, things like that. So it could be done around other chores, around childcare, around other jobs even. It could be done in the evening. If women were leaving the house to go work, they could come home and continue their textile work as a way to earn like a separate income for their family. So there's a lot of examples worldwide where women are primarily the ones who are creating textiles, either by weaving them or other methods. But in at least in the case of sailcloth, to my understanding, is it actually decreased that stratification. So women were so important in society that they were treated nearly as equals. That's not the case everywhere. There's of course like plenty of examples where that's in contemporary society, like right now, there's most garment workers in the world are female and
Hmm.
are definitely not treated as equals in most societies. So
No.
it depends on the time, it depends on the place, it depends on a lot of factors. But yeah, I think you're definitely right about most textile workers being female, but if it increases stratification, that's going to depend on the context specifically.
That makes sense. That makes sense. And it would make sense that, like, a culture where your sailing ships are the core of your economic practices, that these sails would be almost sacred, and the people who make those would be considered very important. Um, are you familiar with how sails are made? Like, is it like a bunch of pieces put together, or is it like really just they get everything together and they weave it all at once? Do you know how that works?
Um, I would say most fabric is limited to the width of the loom that you can make for it. So, and it also depends on how many people you want or can have weaving at one time. So there's a lot of examples of looms that are just the width of a person's wingspan, essentially, because if they're
Yeah.
just themselves weaving, they can only lean side to side to send the shuttle through for for weaving a length of fabric. So that's one big limitation is how many people are weaving and how I guess sedentary that person is going to be weaving. Um, so knowing that, I would say we're probably looking at lengths of fabric to the tune of hundreds of meters that are then stitched together kind of side by side to
Hmm.
make the width of the sail.
Yeah, I guess in my head, and I did a little sailing when I was up at Portland State University. I did like the sailing club, and they're little schooners, so those sails are not very big. But I guess I just always think like sails look so smooth. But then,
Hmm.
like they look like they're one piece, but obviously there's lots of ways they can make those things appear. Um, let's see. We have another one. Oh, here's a good one. What are important and special kinds of clothing tied to cultures that world building should consider? I'm assuming for like ceremonies or something, maybe they're meaning special kinds.
Hmm. Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I think that it will depend on what one considers special, but so just to give some examples, I mentioned textiles being used as currency and as tribute and taxation payment, things like that. There's places where textiles are the bulk of, for example, like a dowry. When a bride is marrying into a family, her dowry will consist largely of textiles. There's places where textiles are given in exchange as if they were, very large sums of money. there's a lot of examples. And then if you go into ceremonial textiles, there's some ceremonial textiles that are made out of um, specific like rare birds' feathers.
Mhm.
And it takes thousands of these birds to get enough feathers for one of these cloaks or something along those lines, right? So yeah, I think if there's lots of ways that you can kind of categorize a textile as special, but if we're thinking about something ceremonial, I would focus on those things that would make it really difficult to acquire, really uncommon to have, right? Like the bird's feathers is a really good example where not only would you have to weave the structure of the textiles, but each feather would have to be stitched on individually in order to make a feather cloak.
Mm.
Or things like that is what I would think of in order to make what I would call like a special textile. It would have to be rare materials, intensive labor, and probably very specialized skills.
Yeah, I made a rabbit skin cloak once for an ex girlfriend when I was a teenager, and it was like one of the most labor intensive things I've ever done. And those leather needles are not a joke.
No,
I had, you know,
punctures,
puncture
yes.
so much in my hands, and I
Yeah.
had quite the calluses. Like, never again. I probably spent
Well, that's
200
also
hours.
yeah, I mean that's real. And I think that you're making a really good point too, is thinking about textiles also includes the various tools that you need to successfully make a textile. So
Right.
thimbles are something that most cultures will have some version of to protect the fingertips and to protect the palms and things like that. Um, and then, obviously needles. Everyone needs needles in order to sew. And those can be made of bone. A lot of them in ancient cultures were made of like bird bone.
Mhm.
Or later on, they were made of steel or iron, things like that. So thinking about, the context of where it's happening will also inform the tools that are being used.
Yeah, yeah. I guess that does make sense. And so, of course, too, like the people who are a higher status in your society, or like maybe hold an important role, like a person is going to have very specific textiles to mark their kind of office, as it were. And those would probably be, as you say, very difficult to acquire or have some particular social and cultural meaning behind what what they're doing. So, you probably wouldn't be making, well, I suppose if you had like some sort of um, death magician or something, they could do vulture feathers or something for their. Because I was
That
going to
would be
say,
badass.
yeah, that would be really cool, actually. Not turkey vultures, though. Turkey vultures are not pretty looking things.
But you bring up another good point is a lot of cultures will do like surface design, and that would be thinking of like embroidered patterns or something like that. That's another way to kind of make a textile extra special is after you go through the labor of weaving it or knitting it or however you've made this textile structure, then adding more to it by embellishing either with embroidery, some sort of like special thread, some sort of special material, shells, all kinds of stuff can be incorporated. Beads, obviously.
Yeah. Um, this one is from what is that? Discord. If you have two cultures with a similar environment, what kind of things would make the choices of the clothing different?
Well, thinking about clothing choice is not necessarily just about the environment, right? Because you're going to have groups of people who maybe value one color over another, or maybe have more access to a certain dye plant that they find to be extra beautiful,
Hmm.
um, or that they find valuable and that they're able to trade, so that they just have this, let's say indigo, because that's going to be like a really common and well-known one. Like indigo is one of those plants where if you know how to work with it, you automatically kind of are in the marketplace in a really special position. So yeah, so I would say there might, if the environments are identical, that's not necessarily to say that groups of people aren't going to want to differentiate themselves from each other. They're going to have slightly different values or customs, things like that. And they're going to, most groups of people at least will use their clothes to try and differentiate themselves from other groups of people for one reason or another.
Yeah, and of course, like as some of you might know from my content, you want to consider schismogenesis, right? Which is identity through opposition. So there may be certain kinds of symbols that a person would like look at the other culture and be like, ah, that what's the opposite of the thing that they're doing with their clothing, so we can make sure that we mark ourselves of different. And like also that's useful on a battlefield, if you're talking about
Hmm.
like when the Europeans are in that the were dressing up in the bright colored clothing and going onto the field with fixed bayonets and firing at each other in a very civilized manner to conduct war, right? So thinking about, what does your adversaries dress like and doing something different because those are the barbarians over there. Everyone is always the barbarians over there, right? So that's something to consider too with this question. We have a question here. Can you provide some insight to what historical textiles, clothing styles, and design skills I can apply to my setting, which has two areas, dealing one with an ice age and the desertification age, sorry, respectively. So I'm guessing like they're having an era of extreme cold and an era of extreme heat. What are some things they should be thinking about?
Um,
And looking for historic examples. They want specifically are
his,
they historic?
sure. I think the examples that come to mind would be in some archaeological finds. Um, And that's going to be kind of going back to the materials that are available in the environment. So, if you're thinking about a desert environment, in addition to things like bird bones for needles, you might also have cactus spines. You might also have thorns on specific plants that you're using to either use as a tool or some sort of way to puncture a textile. The wood available would be something to think about too. Yeah, I think I would just go back to thinking of the environment and all the details that you can kind of like drum up that might be useful as a tool, useful as a fiber, useful as a dye, as an embellishment, and the mobility of the people who are making the textiles at that time too. So if you have
Right.
people who are agricultural and they're staying in one place, then maybe they're growing flax. That wasn't unheard of, in ancient times. Growing flax was one of the earliest crops that humans grew. But if you have a population that's not necessarily sitting still, the way that those textiles are made, they're probably going to be smaller. They're probably going to be lighter weight. Maybe they're working with hides instead of
Mm,
weaving. Hides are very, very common in lots of cultures,
yeah. Inuit, for example.
as a way to cover the body relatively quickly. So yeah, I would again just kind of like dig deep into really thinking about the environment and what's available in the environment in those situations.
Yeah, and it's also important to remember that like a very high heat age or a very significant ice age, um, like there's variation in the environment all over the world and those
Yeah.
places too. Like when we're in an ice age, Florida is still like not going to be that cold. It's going to be colder than it is now, but there's still going to be a lot. It's going to be more temperate. So thinking about like on a global level. Now, if you're talking about like the Arctic Circle, I would think seal skins. If you're talking about like the South Pole, I suppose you could penguins. Like I've never heard of penguins, but in the desert, snake skins or large lizards, depending on what kind of creatures you have there. Cactus is the cactus needles is a really interesting one. Could you make textiles from like cactus itself? Are there any cacti that are tough enough for that?
There are certain species of, I guess, like, I don't know if they would be considered cacti necessarily, but they're succulent plants.
Hmm.
A great example is in the desert southwest of the United States and in Mexico. If you've seen like the big, um, if you've ever seen an agave plant, that's one of the types of these like big succulent plants that grow in these desert regions. And the leaves have fibers in them. So the leaves get broken down and the fibers get dried out and used for textiles. With the caveat, they're not very comfortable to wear. Most people, if they're using those fibers, they're either making sandals or hammocks or more like utilitarian textiles. But but I wanted to kind of actually take one step back because you were talking about all the different animals that provide hides or leather. And that's something actually textile, a hide or leather as a textile is kind of controversial. I
Mm.
personally think hides and leathers are textiles because they're flexible structures that can be molded and sewn and cut and, manipulated into a garment or some sort of like flexible surface. But just know that not everyone agrees with that statement.
Well, you could have two characters who one says this is my art and it is a textile, and the other character, refuses to touch hides, right? I mean, you could make that into kind of like a running joke or something between the characters. I didn't know that. I assumed that anything was fair game for, but I guess my definition of textiles was not as good as now it is that you've come on the show and enlightened me. um, yeah, that was a great question. Thank you, Jason Wolf. Jason is a regular. He comes on here sometimes and asks questions. How do trade networks impact textile traditions? Because obviously networks cause all kinds of cultural change.
Oh, absolutely. Well, think about cotton. Cotton is a great example that the cotton trade changed the world, quite literally. Obviously, it wasn't the only commodity being traded at that time that, inspired the transatlantic slave trade, but it was a huge reason. And alongside cotton during that same time was indigo. Indigo was in really big demand because of its quality as a dye, and it's very actually hard to find a plant that yields a blue dye. So just using those two examples, I think most people are familiar with at least the cotton trade and how that impacted, global economies and things like that, especially here in the United States. There's another really great example from Mexico, though. In Oaxaca, there's these little insects that grow on cactus paddles that when you squish them, their blood, I guess, makes a color fast and light fast, brilliant red dye. And it's just this one species of insect that lives in this one area of Mexico. And it just is such a unique, and it became such an in-demand dye that an entire trade network just into that region of Oaxaca was created at that time and became such an in-demand color. If you think about the color cardinal red, like the cardinals from the Catholic Church, that
Mm,
red is what's called cochineal red. It's from these insects that are endemic and indigenous to Mexico. And yet here they are in the Roman Catholic Church dyeing, these cardinal robes, this beautiful, vibrant, bright red. So there's
wow.
tons and tons of examples about dyes. Dyes are one of those things, just like spices, where you need a lot of the product, the stuff, in order to make so it becomes really valuable really quickly. I think at one point these cochineal insects were worth more by weight than silver was because of how valuable they wanted
Wow.
these Europeans wanted this dye. So there's lots of examples. I think again, just this is why I have chosen to focus on the ethnobiology of textiles because there are just so many fascinating examples of the way that, a certain bug in Mexico changed trade routes, changed demand, changed like value of other commodities on the same trade routes and things like that because of the way that values were, or the way that textiles were valued for those things.
What did cardinals do with their robes before colonization? I guess I don't know.
So there's other ways to make red dye.
Hmm.
There's plants. There's actually a similar insect that's native to the Mediterranean that also makes a red dye, but it just wasn't as pretty. It wasn't as bold. It wasn't as like color fast and light fast and wash fast. So what that means is if you wash it, the color is not coming out. If you leave it in the sun, it's not going to fade very much. So yeah, so there is a similar bug insect in the Mediterranean that makes red dye, but it just wasn't as good as the Mexican version.
Yeah, and I know some of our food coloring is from insects too, right? So and people,
The same insect
is it the
actually. A
same
lot of
insect?
yeah,
Oh, is that why I
yeah.
have red my red M&Ms is a little I know people, people are like, well, it's an insect. It's like, yeah, but humans have eaten insects forever. That's not a new thing. Like, insects are a huge staple of, like, people talk about the paleo diet, which isn't a thing because it's like every culture and civilization ate whatever was around. But insects were a huge staple of the ancient world. People ate bugs all the time because
Hmm.
cheap protein. And, I mean, it's like, I had
And they
a
didn't run away.
and they didn't run away. I had a teacher when I was an undergrad. He was like, we always think of Native Americans on the big, strong, Injun brave on the horse with a with a bow and arrow fighting, fighting the cowboys and stuff. But he's like, but Native Americans are also walking around with baskets and blankets and collecting large amounts of grasshoppers. It's like
Hmm.
and filling them up and roasting them with their pine nuts, and it's
Hmm.
because they're an incredible food source.
Yeah.
So, see, two areas I'm dealing with the true extremes of the two environments as well. I use historic, but I could better specify to between the 1000s or 1800s or so, the majority. Hey, Jason, can you clarify your question a little bit on that second point? Yeah, I know you only have 200 characters. I don't like that YouTube limits our characters like that, but clarify your question a little bit. Um, I mean, obviously, too, silk, which is
Hmm.
another big trade one that really changed the world in a lot of
Yeah.
ways. I mean, the Silk Road, which wasn't one road, it was a series of different trade routes, all between, Asia and Eurasia and all that whole area. So,
Hmm.
um, let's see. I have one more up here somewhere. Where is it? There it is. Um, you kind of answered that one. Oh, here's one for you. What's the most unexpected textile tradition you've ever run across?
I would say, and I don't even, now that I know about it, I don't even think it's that unexpected, but fish leather. For me, when I found out about fish leather and how easy it is to make and how
Hmm.
many different cultures made fish leather, I was like, whoa, I guess I never thought of that. But fish skin specifically, in a lot of places is used because it's waterproof. So it's used for things like shoes
Hmm.
and like waterproof suits and things like that. And I don't know, I guess I didn't really think about utilizing fish in that way. And then once I saw it as, fish leather, I was like, oh, this is of course. And that's
Yeah.
like incredible. Yeah, fish leather is one of those where I it's so beautiful too. It really
Yeah.
is. It's so beautiful.
Yeah, I didn't know it was a thing until I lived up in the Pacific Northwest and saw some of the indigenous cultural material and the artifacts, and I was like, oh yeah, that does that. You're right. It's like obvious when you think about it, but then you're like, but then I guess you probably have all kinds of stereotypes about how bad fish smells, but like of course you dry it out and you clean it and all just like you would any other hide. So
Yeah.
yeah, it's definitely an interesting practice. Um, yeah, and I think there's a lot of traditions like that. When you like first hear it, you're like, oh yeah, no, that totally makes sense. Oh, but back to the color thing too. It is also an interesting thing for all of you to consider is that not every culture has a concept of every color. And in fact, it's not often until you can make the color that you have a concept. And the most famous or classic example, and you could check this for yourself if you happen to read and speak ancient Greek. But the ancient Greeks didn't have the color blue. Like that, they described the wine dark sea because they didn't have a concept of blue because they didn't have a reason to have a concept. Or the Kandoshi tribe in the Amazon don't have stable color. Their color fluctuates depending on the context of where the item is. So if you're holding it, there's one word for it. If it's on the ground, there's another for it. If it's on a piece of cloth that you're wearing, it's another word. So this idea that colors are somehow static is, I really wish someone would play with that idea in a fantasy world. In fact, there's the Brent Weeks Lightbringer series, which is color magic. It would have been really interesting. He finished that series, although he did leave it off, so a possible sequel. But it would have been really interesting to have your entire magic system is based on color. What happens when you have a group of people that have unstable color categories? How would that make a new kind of magic system? So just something to think about. Let's see. Yeah, some of these questions are kind of repetitive. I got actually quite a few questions because I post this stuff all over the place, and so I have to kind of gather them up.
One thing I will say about textiles, and I think it's kind of we're proving the point with repeating like the same kind of things over and over, is the way the textiles have been made has basically not changed for tens of thousands of years. We're still doing it largely the same way by going over, under yarns or threads. Even now we have machines doing it, but we're not really changing the way that the structure is made. We're not really changing the way that the tools are being used. So yeah, that's one thing that's really fascinating to me is we figured this out a really long time ago. And I will say, like, I personally think textiles are so embedded in our human experience that, like, we don't even consider them as a technology. We don't consider them as, like a material product of culture or something like that, because we're so used to them being so deeply a part of our lives every day. And actually, there's a funny story, not funny, but it's, it's a hard story to hear. But in the early days of archaeology, there's a lot of accounts where archaeologists would go in and they would find a site and they would start digging and they would find textiles either on top of something or in a bundle or something like that. And they'd just be like, oh, get this out of the way, like toss it aside, throw it away, burn it, whatever they did, because they wanted to get to like the ceramics or the grave goods or the bronze or whatever was underneath it. And to me, that's just exemplary of like how really we take textiles for granted in our everyday lives.
Yeah.
Because even an archaeologist looking at a textile that maybe would have been 5,000 years old. And if you think about it, textiles, especially if they're made out of organic materials, now we're learning now with most textiles being made of petroleum that they're not breaking down, but for the vast majority of human experience, textiles have been made of organic materials that break down. So
Right.
even finding a textile that's 50 years old is a very unique find.
Right.
So finding a textile that's 1,000 years old, 10,000 years old, it's not going to happen very often.
No.
But when we do find those textiles in really dry climates like Peru or the Middle East or something like that,
Andean
we're seeing
mummies.
that, yeah, we're seeing that the textile structures are basically the same. Any tools that are being found with them, it's basically the same. The process hasn't changed that much. It's like we figured it out really early, and it was kind of a perfect technology from really early on.
Yeah, and it's probably one of the most important technologies because it allowed us to survive all kinds of different climates that we would not have been able to survive otherwise. I mean, even if you think about a spacesuit as a textile,
Hmm.
right? I mean,
Absolutely.
it just has to be, you know, sealed, and be able to be pressurized and stuff. And it's like, it's the textile that allows humans to survive outside the atmosphere of the earth. But it is really funny because, like, when I'm building my own fictional worlds, I really don't think about textiles very much. So,
Hmm.
oh, we have a question here from YouTube. So Jason's follow up to that was, using techniques available by the 1600s, how might people be able to survive a brutal 10-month long winter?
Hmm. I would say hides are probably going to be the most common.
Hmm.
And again, it'll depend on the region, but I do think that there's probably some good research out there, especially if you're thinking like Europe and the Mediterranean. There's a lot of research that has been done about textiles and apparel from that region and that era. But most commonly, I would expect to see hides and the tools that would accompany using
Yeah.
hides. And hides don't have to be just like, draped over as like kind of a cape or a wearable blanket or something like that. A lot of people were fashioning hides into actual garments that they pulled over their head or pulled on like pants or a skirt or something like that. So thinking about the different ways that hides have been used is probably where I would at least put my focus.
Yeah, and then kind of a follow up. So their character is you said it was a seamstress. Is that a seamstress? And caravaneer is so I guess they're nomadic in that particular case. So the question is, how would the extreme heat or extreme cold impact the fashion? Because the character is someone who modifies clothing and sees their clothing as essential sign for their work. So, like, probably like a signature or a personal. I mean, it's like modern fashion.
This actually is going to allow me to get a little bit nerdy because this is
Go
something
for it.
this is really fascinating to me. So, um, once I say this, it's probably not going to be that surprising, but the tighter your clothing fits to the body, the colder you're going to be. So a lot of places, because if you're thinking about the way that the human body releases heat and needs to breathe and sweats and all of those things, most places with extreme cold or extreme heat or something where the environment is extremely uncomfortable to be in without some sort of garment, you're going to see that they're loose fitting and that there's a lot of air layers. So, for example, wool, like the structure of the wool fiber itself is hollow, which is one of the reasons why it's so warm, because you kind of like have this insulation layer. And so like once you think about it that way, well, that makes sense, right? That like if you have, let's say, a hide garment, you're going to want there to be space between the skin and the garment itself so that air and heat can kind of become trapped in there. And that's going to be part of your insulative layer. And it's the same thing with heat, right? I'm thinking about linen. So linen has an interesting structure where it's really, really strong and really fine, but it feels cool to the touch when it's like out in the heat, out in the environment. So that's why it's, I think that's why the plant has been adopted as like one of the primary fibers for making clothing in hot environments because of the innate properties that it has. Um, that are suited to kind of like regulating body temperature. So that's something that I would think about too is like whether we're talking about linen clothing or hides as clothing, if you have extreme heat or cold, you're going to want there to be space between the garment and the body. Um, and there's also a lot of research on this as well. So I would just invite this person to dig a little bit into the research because there's a lot of really interesting like kind of technical studies about why that is and how it works.
Yeah, and it's just like when I went to Egypt and I was, around. I looked in what kind of clothing should I wear there because even though I went in April, I mean, it was still like 100 degrees because this, right on the equator. So I wore long, flowy linen kind of shirts with long sleeves and like loose khaki pants. Like that was what I wore most of the time, and I kept me pretty cool. Like in the Valley of Kings, where it was like 110 degrees Fahrenheit or 40 in whatever it is in Celsius. I'm not very good with that because I'm an American, but it was so hot. But then there was these people, wearing flip flops and shorts, and I was just kind of like, that's not what you're supposed to wear in the desert, bro. Like that's foolish because then you lose your sweat and you overheat really fast. You want to wear loose, flowy clothing, which is why, like, when people talk about like the burqa as oppression, it's like, well, this is also a technology of clothing required to survive a desert environment that came long before Islam was around. Like people had dressed in the deserts like that forever. If you lived in a desert
Mm-hmm.
environment, that's how you dressed because that's what made sense. Once you get air conditioning, you can modify that kind of stuff, but the reality is like wearing shorts and a t-shirt everywhere, which I do in this very hot environment in the Colorado summer right now, where it's been ridiculously hot, like in the hundreds, like record-breaking number of 100-degree temperatures lately and stuff. Like that is still foolish, but we probably should start thinking about adopting some of the loose flowing clothing here. So
But you're also bringing up a good point because I'm thinking about like the wind and sand blowing around
yeah.
and things like that. So the clothing is on the one hand helping regulate the body temperature to make you more comfortable in that environment, whether it's hot or cold, but it's also protecting your skin because the skin is actually really sensitive to extreme like temperature changes. So yeah, there's a lot of reasons why clothing are worn in specific environments, and just going back to thinking about like what the climate is, what the environmental conditions are, what kind of plants are in the environment. Does it rain frequently? If so, you're not going to want to wear some garments and you'll want to replace them, or maybe you won't want to wear any in that environment. And textiles are used for something else, like bowstrings,
Mhm.
or fishing line, or fishing nets, or snares, or something like that. So there's a lot of there textiles kind of really cover the spectrum between being strictly utilitarian to strictly ceremonial and literally everything in between.
Yeah, and if you're in an extremely humid environment, as few clothes as possible because you get all kinds of weird infections and fungus and like there was a story of Tom's shoes, right? And like the whole Tom's shoes, if you guys don't know, it was this for-profit shoe company, and they championed this new model of a one for one. You buy a pair of our shoes, we send one to a poor person in the third world country, right? And well, some people got those shoes and they were wearing them, and it caused things like trench foot because
Hmm.
they had not worn shoes previously. Because if you're in a jungle environment, in an extremely humid environment, and you don't change your socks constantly, you get trench foot and all kinds of other infections. And so, like, there again, like, you have to, so that's why when you see pictures of people in the Amazon, they're wearing like a cloth, like they're wearing a loincloth, and that's it. There's not much else because you don't really want to have too much on because it can cause all kinds of issues. Um, okay, one more question here from the. So in this setting, there is a magical enchantment that lets you swap certain physical traits from one material to another. Would it be better to try and make metals lighter or making textiles tougher? Or any other weird or interesting things you can think of coming from being able to change these physical traits?
That's interesting. So, first thing that comes to mind is Kevlar versus like chainmail.
Mm-hmm.
Chainmail still technically is a textile, even though it's what I would consider like a rigid textile.
I
It's
got
still a
some right
textile
behind
because
me.
it moves. Versus Kevlar, which is obviously synthetic that's been engineered to have a certain performance level. Um, That's kind of where I would start playing with that idea. I think it depends on like, for me at least, it would depend on what the textiles end use would be if I was going to, and if it was going to be worn or if it's going to be used, for example, as like a protective, some sort of shield or garment or something like that. That would be kind of where I started differentiating what properties I wanted versus um, the the use of the textile itself.
Yeah, and I would think so. You're talking about how wool has lots of open spaces. Is it kind of like a weave almost? Like it's like a what does it look like? Is it like woven in and out naturally? How exactly does the wool work? Because I'm just thinking
So
like maybe you could switch that to Kevlar or something like that if you were
yeah,
having
that's
magic.
super interesting. So wool is essentially a hair, and just like human hair, it has these little scales on the outside of it. And those scales typically all go in one direction so that, if, for example, if this is the direction of the fiber, water would be repelled down if it goes this way. And if all the fibers are going in the same direction, then you get kind of like a smooth texture, and you'll get like you can get a really fine spin on it. The fiber itself is the hollow part that I was speaking to earlier. So that's not something that you'd be able to like observe without a microscope, for example, but it's part of what gives it the properties that most people wear wool for, because it helps with the temperature regulation with that like built-in insulation. But so if all the fibers are going in the same direction, then you can get like a nice spin on there. And you can get a nice, what's called like a smooth hand on it. So when you run your hand on it, it feels nice and smooth. But if the fibers get jumbled up, if anyone's ever worn a wool sweater under the arms, you get pills, you get mats, things like that. And it's because those scales that are on the fiber itself end up locking together, and that's called
Mm.
felting. Now, interestingly, felt is a completely different kind of wool fabric that is almost completely waterproof and really warm, really insulative, can be used as, for example, like the outside of a yurt, or it could be used as a coat or a cloak or something like that. Some people will use it as, boot liners, things like that. So the way, I think mostly I'm trying to illustrate that the way this one fiber can have a lot of different properties depending on how it's essentially processed, and like what other kind of elements are introduced into the processing.
Yeah. That's fascinating. So I guess you would just be taking some sort of fiber and you would be spinning it. So let's say you had an army of soldiers and like if you have this property to be able to switch out things, that'd actually be pretty nifty because the soldiers would have to wear heavy armor all the time. They could just, and I don't know how your magic system works, if it's individual or it's like someone who has to cast this. But if let's say every soldier has the property, they could just be wearing like loose fitting, well insulated clothing and then like transform their cloth into like the essential like it would be like chainmail almost or Kevlar in that particular case. That's like a really interesting idea to play with. Thanks for sharing
Yeah.
that idea, Jason, and thanks for all the questions today. I have two questions for you. One is the first question is what are some resources? Obviously your Substack has lots of great information, so definitely check out Sarah's Substack, the Textile Anthropologist, for information about textiles. But are there any other books or resources or videos or anything you would recommend for world builders thinking about textiles and their world building?
There's a really great book, and there's kind of two versions of the same book. There's more of like a popular version, and there's more of an academic version, but it's by the same author. And I will say this author, it was like the one of the main reasons why I started putting together all of these concepts when I first read her book. So the book that I read is called Women's Work, and the author is Elizabeth Wayland Barber. If anyone is familiar with my work, I talk about her all the time. I have joked that, that my Substack and my Instagram and Threads followers, we've created the informal Elizabeth Wayland Barber fan club, because we all kind of have the same story, where we read this book called Women's Work. It was published in the early 90s, and she really talks about how, getting back to our discussion about gender, about how women were so largely invisible in the archaeological record because what they were doing was making perishable cultural materials.
Oh.
And but she also kind of talks about the different ways that you can see evidence of cloth being made, and her interpretation of, of all these things. And then by the same author, she wrote a book that's more on the academic side called Prehistoric Textiles. That book to me is not even a hard read for an academic read. It's dense, of course, and there's a lot of technical information. There's a lot of information about archaeological textiles. It's mostly focused on the Mediterranean, which is where I believe she did her research. And but it's kind of the big brother of the women's workbook. Women's work was definitely made for a popular audience, and Prehistoric Textiles was made for more of an academic audience. But I don't think that it's a difficult read. I think there's just tons of information in there that's really, really good food for thought.
I'm gonna have to put those ones on my shelves for sure. I guess I hadn't. That's such an interesting thing about the archaeological record that I had never considered. That one of the reasons that women don't show up as much is if they are doing a lot of the very important and necessary work that does not stick around for very long. That is organic stuff does not last.
Mm-hmm.
Even leather stuff doesn't last, very long in most conditions. So
Mm-hmm.
that's fascinating. Yeah, I'm definitely gonna have to get a copy of those books and read them for myself. So the final question. This is for you. If you were building a fantasy culture yourself, what's one real world textile practice you definitely want to include because it's so fascinating?
Ooh. Um, so I will say, like, weaving is pretty ubiquitous worldwide. So weaving is something that would have to be there, not because it's fascinating, but because it's absolutely necessary. So whether that's a backstrap loom or a table loom or a floor loom, some sort of apparatus to weave is absolutely critical. But one thing that I think is really cute and fun is people who just pluck fur off of live animals and use that. So they're just kind of like going along and like picking it up, like boop, 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 and like that's how they're getting their fiber to make textiles. I just think that's very cute. And I think it would make a very like lovely little, like, especially like a character development based on somebody who maybe prances around the woods and
Oh, there's a
like finds
deer.
bunnies. Exactly. Like I love that idea.
That's yeah, that would make for a very eccentric and interesting character too, for sure. A very memorable character as well. So, well, thank you so much, Sarah, for coming today. We really appreciate you sharing all your wonderful knowledge. Gosh, I learned so much. When I pitched this idea to you, I mean, I knew I didn't know a lot about textiles, but I didn't know how much I didn't know. So it's been really wonderful, and we really appreciate you. So thanks for coming on.
Thanks, Michael.